Hello everyone, welcome to That's Blockchain. Today's talk is going to be on privacy and anonymity and how blockchains and cryptocurrency sort of incorporate these features. And there are two speakers today from Badger Blockchain, so Brennan and Dan. They've been part of Badger Blockchain for the last whole year. They do a lot of research and development for the organization. Really, if you didn't know what Badger Blockchain is, it's a student organization at UW-Madison. The goal for Badger Blockchain is to sort of provide a community on blockchain and provide educational resources to students and also the greater Madison community so people can really enter the ecosystem of blockchain. So yeah, I'll let them introduce themselves and take it over from here.
Alright, so like Sid said, my name is Brennan. I've been with Badger Blockchain since it started, which was sort of like maybe a year ago, right? A little under that. I've been in this space for maybe over a couple of years now. Not really specifically in blockchain now, just for a year.
Yeah, and I've been into cryptocurrency ever seeing a podcast, a Joe Rogan podcast, if you guys are familiar with that. He did a podcast with one of the big Bitcoin talkers. He travels around the world, Antonopoulos, Greek guy. So ever since then, I met Sid last semester as well, working with Badger Blockchain, specifically use case analysis, but now doing some just freelance work and research on my own.
And just before we start to it, if no one's heard, I think it's good just to mention that we actually have a course coming to UW. I don't know, you didn't mention that, have you? Did you?
Yeah, so at UW we're going to launch a course next fall for students. It's going to be mostly tailored for MBA students. It's going to be taught by a professor from the business school. His name is Brad Chandler. So yeah, we're really excited for that. It's going to be with 65 students. And it's going to be an introduction to Bitcoin and blockchain technology. So really excited for that. That's like pretty big news for us.
Stuff is catching on.
Exactly. Maybe we can eventually get one in the CS department, but that's good for now. So we just wanted to introduce this talk. Obviously, there's a lot of talk specifically with scaling last year, and I think privacy and anonymity is one of those topics that's always good just to bring up to refresh yourself, because this is a topic that you can kind of marginally lose interest in, and at times it can come back to bite you in the ass. And so the subtitle is because it's cryptocurrency, just to emphasize that the people in the beginning of the space gave it that name just to show you how important it is to the space.
And also a quick disclaimer, a lot of this stuff is very high-level mathematic topics, dating back, the concept of cryptography dates back to World War II, and the Zimmerman code even. So a lot of this stuff is very in-depth, and I don't think we would call ourselves experts on it. We just have something of a cursory understanding of this stuff, so we want to give you guys an outline of what the privacy coin scene looks like today, basically, which is still very much in working, and people are working on this stuff, every day. And there's a lot of work to be done, I think you'll find out.
Yep, so just wanted to quickly break this down. So if anyone here wants to give me a definition of these two terms, how do you distinguish these two terms? Anyone think they can distinguish it?
Does anybody think they're synonyms?
Right.
I think privacy, I have privacy, but for example, if I were to transact with you, we have a private transaction where I know that I'm transacting with you. I guess anonymous would be, we have no idea who is involved.
Yeah, that's basically right on it. And that's, I think, he gives it good with the symbol, with the superhero. You know what he's doing, but you don't know who he is. Well, with privacy, you kind of control, you have that control over who sees what. So just making that clear. So, and then again, the reason I wanted to bring up this talk is, again, if you follow any of Andreas, specifically who Dan was talking about, I would highly recommend him. He's really influential. It's the first person I've been listening to since I got in this space. And one of the big points he's been addressing is privacy, and the fact that specifically Bitcoin's really interesting, but there's obviously other coins, Monero and Zcash, that offer something that Bitcoin could never do. And so a lot of the things that he says, I really follow. And then again, this is just the other slide. I just want to quickly mention this. If you watched his most recent video, he talked about how a lot of technology nowadays are starting to press and make us question a lot of ethical questions. And you kind of have to measure where does these costs outweigh, or where do the benefits outweigh the costs to society? You have to ask that question. Specifically, this is a big deal with privacy, and specifically privacy-focused altcoins. People will buy drugs with them, but you have to ask, do people want their privacy over that? And that's just not just with cryptocurrencies. That's with anything if you look at CRISPR, that's a great question of an ethical question of do we start playing with Mother Nature, or automated driving cars? How are they going to choose what accident to, or if an automated driving car is faced with an accident that can't be avoided, how do they make the decision? And so it's kind of questioning ethics and keeping that thought in mind. You want to just...
Yeah, so privacy for financial freedom. There's a reason that cash does so well in today's economy and the economy of the past. It's a pretty almost perfectly anonymous means of transaction. Without anonymity, that means it doesn't matter. There's always going to be this third party, whether it's a credit card company or any type of bank. Trusted third party that's going to be able to see your information. So a lot of the goal of these currencies is to eliminate that trusted third party. And there's reasons why you don't want the third party to be able to access your business information, transactional information in a competitive environment. Margin's critical, and anytime you can maybe see how much a competitor is paying for their supplies, or your landlord is able to see your income, there's a reason that information should stay private in an ideal environment. That's all I have for this slide. For political freedom as well, we're seeing a lot of this stuff. Venezuela just launched their own cryptocurrency, the Petro, which is a highly controversial topic in itself. They have a history of, I think pretty recently they went around and were able to locate a lot of the people mining Bitcoin in their country. So they kind of just seized all those assets from what I read, because that information is out there. We're dealing with a blockchain. This is all very transparent information that is getting dealt here. So you have to maintain that mindset that it's all visible. And again, this is one of the things we're trying to fix with the privacy coin movements, as well as if you're funding, you never know, in some of these other countries, if you're a political dissident to the reigning power, there's reasons for them to want to be able to find who you are, who's funding you, and shut you down through those means. So it's definitely a cause worth fighting for. We maybe are a little lucky here in the U.S. We don't have to worry about this stuff as much, but that's not the case in a lot of the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that point's really clear. You don't always realize how good privacy is until you lose it. That's the point that I always like hearing. So basic outline, just again, how we're going to address this presentation for the rest. We're just going to go over some basic fundamentals of privacy, focus on ways that specific cryptocurrencies like Zcash, Monero, which you're probably familiar with, address it. If you're familiar with CoinJoin and Tumblebit, and how they use mixing, and then also ways that you can de-anonymize someone within the network, how do you link their address to their actual real-world identity, and then some future implementations of certain projects that people are looking to in 2018 that are a good question for some thoughts in regards to privacy. So that's with Schnorr signatures, imblewimble, and Grin, and then Lightning in addressing that. So you want to just start off with some of the basics?
Yeah, so does anybody here, how many of you think that Bitcoin is a private system for transacting right now? Does anybody think that? Does anybody think it's perfectly anonymous? No, it isn't. It's what they're calling pseudo-anonymous, in the same way that you make a username on Reddit or any other platform, your email address, and there isn't necessarily a direct link there between your identity and that signature or that key. But there are ways to draw correlations between the two. This has been done by law enforcement agencies already. So yeah, nothing's 100% private. You'll also see here there's a very much of a spectrum of, you've got your perfectly non-private entities like some of the more mainstream exchanges like Coinbase that use what are called KYC protocols and policies where you have to show your driver's license to get an account, versus maybe a Binance where you really just need an email address to get started on there. And anytime you're even buying any of these coins, if you're not using the right protocols just for your network, there's always holes in that for your privacy too. So that's done or addressed via things like Tor, onion routing, and VPN networks. So there's a spectrum here, and to become perfectly anonymous is not easy. You have to take a lot of different steps to do that.
Right. And then the last key thing here is fungibility, and this is a big term you'll hear in any of the privacy focused altcoins, is specifically making sure that every unit of a currency is equal to the value of another unit. So $1 is equal to $1. I have here, 1 pound of gold is equal to 1 pound of gold. And that sounds pretty easy to understand at first when you think about it, but this is a really important concept. So this doesn't just exist within cryptocurrency, this exists outside with our fiat system. So for example, like if you were to go and exchange like $10 to a vendor, some vendors might not accept a torn up, bloodied, drug-filled dollar bill, right? Because it has low fungibility. And that's a problem if you have that in cryptocurrencies, because people might not start accepting, tainted bitcoins essentially. And so it would I would not question the fact or thought that you probably likely start to see freshly mint bitcoins being sold at a premium within the near future, specifically because they're fresh, they don't have any back into them. It would make a lot of sense in my mind.
Yeah, you might not want a Bitcoin that's made its rounds around the Silk Road or whatever.
Right. It's the same thing in business. You don't want to have drug money in your business.
Yeah. So this is kind of like how it maybe works today or in the past. This is Walter White from Breaking Bad. Hopefully you understand the reference. He was money laundering his cash through a car wash, which is, I think, a pretty common money laundering scheme for some criminals. But basically it's providing this filter through which to legitimize money that is made in the wrong markets. So right now, in traditional enterprise business, there's these two options here. I use Mickey's on the left because I know that they're a cash-only business. As a business owner, I think the ideal, a lot of businesses would like to be cash-only, apart from the logistics of, speaking from personal experience, having to deal with a cash register is kind of a pain in the ass at times. Cash is dirty, but there should be an alternative between the completely all cash business and something like this Amazon Go, where people are now trying out these non-cash businesses, but that's dependent on the credit card processing system, which is perfectly transparent, and that you're giving up all your information to that third party.
And we'll address specifically mixing a little bit, but I think, so we're going to start talking about privacy-focused altcoins. Obviously, I think maybe some of you were here for Justin, who came out in November to specifically talk about Monero. We learned a lot there, and maybe later down the road we can do a really in-depth analysis on Zcash. This is just going to be a high-level overview. So the two most well-known are Monero and Zcash. There's other ones, obviously, like Verge and Dash, PivX, but I think these are the two big players in the privacy-focused altcoin space. So I'm going to start with Zcash, and he will start with Monero, but in order to start understanding Zcash, you have to understand what a zero knowledge proof is. So this was a concept that only was created maybe a couple years ago by a professor. I think he's from Israel, and he's currently on the Zcash team, and it's this proof that essentially states that a method that allows one party, the prover, to prove to another the verifier, that a statement is true without revealing any information beyond the validity of the statement itself. And so I don't like just writing that definition because it can be kind of hard to understand. So the best way I've learned is through some videos. So let's say I wanted to prove to Dan, okay, I'm just going to use you example and everyone will represent Dan. So I have 2 pens right here, right? And the idea is that everyone here in this room is going to be Dan, okay? So let's pretend that everyone's colorblind right now and they do not believe me when I say that these 2 pens, this pen is black and this pen is red. You know, everyone is colorblind, so they see that these 2 pens are actually black, right? But I see this as red. And so what I'm going to be able to do is saying that, you know, I want to prove to you that these 2 pens are different colors. This one's red and this one's black. Again, remember, he sees these 2 as black. So with a zero knowledge proof, the way I can do this is I would give these to Dan, and I would tell him to put it behind his back and swap them if he wants to or not, right? And he will reveal it to me.
I'm not going to tell you whether I swapped them.
No, you reveal it to me. And it looks like he did, so because I started out here on this side and now I'm here, and then I would say, okay, you can swap them again if you want to, or you don't have to swap them. And you didn't swap them. And essentially, I can do this process several more times, and that would actually allow for him to verify that there's no way I'd be guessing, right? I mean, you could not get down to that kind of level. So I'm not revealing any information in this process, and this is pretty key to a zero knowledge proof. And so there's 3 criteria that you need to have for a zero knowledge proof. You need to have completeness, so both parties need to be honest, then the proof is valid. Soundness, if the prover does not know the statement is secret, like if I don't know that this pen was actually red, then I could not prove it, which is a pretty obvious statement. And then zero knowledge. After the protocol, or after we had that interaction, the verifier, Dan, learns nothing more than the statement itself. And that's a pretty basic level of how zero knowledge proof works, but essentially this is something that could be even great past cryptocurrencies, you know, specifically with voting. You know, you could prove to someone you did in fact vote, but you wouldn't have to reveal who it was you voted for. And so, you know, again, the key is you didn't reveal any information in this process. And then this kind of is where specifically Zcash comes into play. So if you're familiar, if you've heard of the term Zcash Snarks, this basically term for succinct, non-interactive arguments of knowledge. Basically, it's just kind of like the cryptographic magic black box that Zcash has. This project is very mathematically intensive. Everyone on the team is from like Harvard and Berkeley. It's a very mathematical white paper, and I don't even think like this would even be a good place to really dissect most of that. But essentially what you should understand and take away from Zcash Snarks is that it allows for transactions to reveal nothing about the inputs or the addresses and their respective values. That's the big takeaway from this. And I will show you kind of a little bit of how the transactions work, but just know that you're not revealing anything in this process. And in addition to, I thought this was kind of neat, but Snarks can also be implemented within, and they have been implemented within Ethereum, JP Morgan's Quorum, which is their blockchain, and then also Bitcoin Private, which is a hard fork of Bitcoin. So just to kind of give you a little background on how a Zcash transaction would work on a very high level. So as we're familiar with, you have Bitcoin, right, and your input is basically your next output, right? Well, in Zcash, instead, how it works is that your input is actually a zero knowledge proof of validity, and this is essentially saying that you do, in fact, have enough Zcash to pay for this transaction. You're not going to show how much it is, but you're at least proving that you do have enough to provide for that. And then what your output essentially would be essentially the parameters that you would need for the next person to set up their zero knowledge proof of validity, as you can see over there. And they could decrypt this through a public key, and it essentially is what keeps everything private. I don't think we really want to dissect it too much because, again, like Zcash is really mathematically intensive, but that's kind of on a basic level of how it works. And then just a little bit more knowledge about Zcash too is that Zcash has, while it is a private altcoin, you can use it in both, and when I say shielded, this just basically means private. You can use Zcash in both private and transparent, so you can have both ways. So that's also good when you want to use a view key to audit. Eventually, I know their team wants to have everything in a shielded manner though. This is completely anonymous, so it's likely the best. Like if you want to find the most anonymous altcoin, you'd use Zcash, but there's reasons why I personally would choose Monero over it. It's very versatile, so like I said, you could use Zcash Snarks in Ethereum, you can use them on Quorum, you can use them any kind of like consensus mechanism. But the drawback of using a Zcash Snark is that they're very heavy. They require a lot of computation to be done. So right now, as you can see, they're currently in their sprout phase, and as it shows, I just pulled this off, but it says like 37 seconds for proving a zero knowledge proof to be valid, and it takes over like 3 gigabytes to prove it, and that's really not something you want. So I know that like if there was some recent news recently where they are moving to sapling in the later this summer, which would basically make it so you could do snarks on your phone essentially, which is pretty insane. I don't follow Zcash too often, but I know that this is a big movement that they're having. It would require a hard fork, but it's I've heard it's something to think about. And then two like additional concepts that you may hear that Zcash doesn't do really well is that it requires a trusted setup. So when they first set up Zcash, actually you have to have like the founder, Zuku Wilcox, and like 5 other people had to essentially
Set you up. They have to get you started.
Yeah, they had to. It's like they had to set up certain parameters into the environment. They set it like almost like a master key that they said they destroyed. I mean, there's videos you can specifically go onto their Zcash channel and find out this setup phase, but it's very controversial because when they generated this key, essentially it could provide a backdoor to generating as much Zcash as they would potentially want. Obviously, they said they destroyed it, but some people don't trust them. And that's why Starks, if you've ever heard that term, it's another term that would eliminate this need for that trusted setup. And then finally, the last point really quickly is this name of Founders Reward that's in Zcash. So for the first 4 years of Zcash's life cycle, 20% of the mining reward goes to the founders of the team. And that's a big controversial, like that's 10% of the total supply within Zcash. And that's a significant amount. So that's kind of like some drawbacks within it, but it's really interesting. It's very secure, but there's some things that, people might choose to use something like Monero.
Yeah, so Monero originally started off as Bytecoin, and Monero's main piece of technology that they utilize is the concept of ring signatures. This is taking your signature along with a pool of other individuals who is probably randomly selected, and they're all thrown in and kind of mixed up with each other. This is also known as stealth addressing, I believe. And that way that if you look in the middle of the transaction, you won't be able to tell and identify, map on this signature to this person who initialized the transaction. And also in this process, the amounts that we're dealing with are broken up into smaller and smaller amounts so that you can't link one number to the number at the end, ideally. We'll talk a little bit later about how that can be worked around. Go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So untraceable payments. Alice has her private key that she signs with. There's another, Alice has a public key, so she's got these 2 private and public key signatures. That's how it works with Bitcoin. If it was that, there's the one-to-one mapping of the private keys. With Monero, there's 3 examples here, but you could have much more added on to that to increase the probability that you're not linked to any transaction. So you have everybody signs the transaction, and then everybody verifies the transaction on the other end. So there's this dissipation of linkability to the transaction. Next slide. This is also another way to visualize it. Instead of an easy mapping of B to Z, there's all these different ways that it can go through the network, and that's mathematically ingrained in the system. So there's ways to use mathematics to maybe draw probabilities as to whether it came from B or C to Z, but it's not a perfect system that way. It's a way to increase that kind of anonymization. One thing to definitely note about these coins is you'll hear some of even the Bitcoin main developers, Bitcoin core developers. Personally, I've heard them, trash on some of these systems because of the increased data. It's sometimes measured 17 times as much information needs to be processed in order to handle all these extra cryptographic features. So you hear things like, oh, Bitcoin is very energy intensive, it's using too much energy, yada yada. But there's a reason why it was kind of optimized to use the energy that it does. It's the least amount possible. If you were to suddenly put the transaction volume of a Bitcoin network onto something like Monero, the amount of power that you would need to do it would increase very significantly, and the network would also be slowed down in that process. So one of the proposed solutions to this in the works right now is this bulletproofing system. The main work is being done by Gregory Maxwell, working off Adam Back. Adam Back was one of the original, I think he'd be called a cypherpunk himself, but he originally introduced the idea back when Bitcoin was first getting proposed around 2008 as something that they might want to consider building into the network. It hasn't been really put into Bitcoin until, it still hasn't, but this bulletproofing is another 42-page academic white paper that is so over my head. It's really high-level mathematics that would probably take a lifetime's worth of really grappling and understanding. But through this, I'm going to call it mathematical magic, they're claiming that they can reduce size of files or transactions, from 8 kilobytes to 734 kilobytes. That's like 11 times smaller. So this would be something that would be huge for scaling these kind of anonymous networks. There's no trusted third party necessary. So they're working on it right now, but that's something that hasn't been implemented in the real world yet. And it's kind of a moonshot hope for the network. Another thing you'll find is some of these systems, maybe we don't have to handle all the Bitcoin transactions on a system like Monero. There's ideas that you could use some of these other solutions as a bit of a second layer, where maybe something is converted from the Bitcoin into Monero if you want it to be private, and maybe you don't want all your transactions to be private because it might cost more for it to be private. So then the money moves through Monero and then is converted back into Bitcoin on the other end. But again, this is just stuff that people are thinking about with these things today. So I kind of touched on earlier, but other potential pitfalls to privacy coins. If it's purchased on an exchange with KYC policies, that's a total pitfall to your anonymization. Slower transaction times, higher transaction fees. Sometimes the quantity does remain visible, and with the rise of things like machine learning that you see today, there was a project out of the University of Illinois where they were actually able to, with Monero, go back and analyze all of the past transactions pre-February of 2017 and basically they linked, I think, 80% of the transactions from initiator to the end user through using these machine learning techniques and pattern recognition. And so something to keep in mind, again, with the blockchain, all this information is theoretically, set in stone. It's going to be passed on from generation to generation. So if in 20 years suddenly the system comes out that's just so good at analyzing these networks, it's going to be pretty tough to proof these things for that kind of ultimate test that it'll face down the road. That's all I have for this slide. So just kind of a graph of where these different things compare with another. Bitcoin has pretty much failed the fungibility test until now, so that's something to keep in note. This really sheds Monero in the best light as something that's private, fungible, and decentralized. But there's always trade-offs with these different systems.
And then some of you may have been, if you hold Monero, I'm guessing you've probably been noticing the price has been going up pretty significantly. So on the 14th, actually what you're going to see is there's going to be a hard fork. Monero is set up where every 6 months they have a non-contentious hard fork. It's just the way that Monero works specifically, but there's another hard fork coming up, and it's called Monero V, I believe. The reason I haven't done too much research into this is because from what I've learned from Justin, who was the guy that came out from Monero a couple months ago, specifically he said that this was going to be I don't want to say any financial information, but this is like a way that is kind of like not like a scam, but it's kind of dangerous because Monero, it's called Monero V. Monero V they want to solve the fact that there's no hard cap on Monero. They're like, okay, we want to provide that. But it's a little wishy-washy, and I would highly recommend you do your research before you automatically claim them. Just keeping that out there.
Yeah, so right now, like the supply of Monero, theoretically, Bitcoin is going to be 21 million in 2140. Monero has built into it something like a 10% inflation rate per year, something like that. I believe it's a linear thing. So do most other coins like Ethereum. Ethereum right now, if the growth stays where it's at, is on track to have, I think like 14 quadrillion, something really just out there by the time that Bitcoin achieves its 21 million. So just something to keep an eye on with these things. And so what will happen is hopefully through consensus, people will come to an agreement on how that kind of inflation rate should take flight, or whatever you want to call it.
Exactly. Okay, so just cover a little bit about mixing and tumbling. You probably have heard about these terms, and just kind of go over them really quickly. So do you want to cover how it works in the real world?
Yeah, so with a typical money laundering scheme, as you see, the money is made through whatever legal means that it needs to get washed. That's done through somehow getting into the financial system, whether that's done through hopefully like a car wash or some sort of more legitimate business. And then there's ways of just moving it around through those networks, and then eventually it becomes untraceable back to the original source of that money, and is effectively clean in the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the point of mixing and the purpose of to actually establish a tumbler mixer in the first place is that, I guess statement right there, to mix one's funds with others, intending to obscure the trail to the original source. You would do this for a number of reasons, but what you want to end up getting out of a good mixer is there's some, I listed them right here exactly, but you want to increase your anonymity set. The more people you have in the mixer, or the more mixes you do, obviously is going to increase. You want to have this done in a trustless environment. You don't want to have the potential for people to be logging. If you vote or if you approve of a mix, if you want to include yourself in a mix, you don't want people to log that information. You want to make sure that the funds can potentially be released at a random time, because you don't want people to link you when the tumbling's done. And then it should be obvious it should not be obvious you're mixing in the first place. That raises a red flag right there, because why would you be doing mixing in the first place if you have something to hide, right? So there's several types of mixings you can think of. One of the first mixers that started out was centralized mixing, and this is potentially just a slush fund of different Bitcoins. So obviously you can see here is like you would put yourself in a multi-signature transaction, and then with a central third party, you would have them spit out different transactions. Obviously, this is not used today, and I'll show you the other alternatives, but you did run the risk with stolen funds. You know, if that central third party decided to take those funds. Again, logging is a potential, recording who's using these central funds. And then a single point of failure, if the government decides, hey, I'm going to take over this third party, you're kind of screwed, right? And some examples, like there's very few, but Blindcoin I know is one. They use some blind signature scheme. It's centralized mixing is not really that popular. Decentralized mixing is probably more of what you've heard about. So CoinJoin is a pretty popular one. Mixing coins under a single multi-sig multi-sig transaction. So as you can see here, I'll just point out the picture. So in here we have 20 Bitcoin and we're spending 15, and we have to get a change of 5. And this is a second transaction from someone. So this is Bob and this is Alice. Alice wants to put in 10, and we'll pay out 2 and 2 back for the Bitcoin per change. Obviously, this is just kind of how the UTXO model works within Bitcoin. But within CoinJoin, you're putting yourself in just a transaction of itself, and so you can't link the outputs and inputs to themselves, and that's what makes CoinJoin anonymous, right? It's the assumption here that you want to pass enough transactions through the mixer that with the increased liquidity, you're able to provide for more anonymity, right? So this is trustless, so your funds could be stolen like they can with a centralized mixer, but it does run the risk because what you actually have to do is you have to have communication with CoinJoin off-chain. So that kind of defeats a little bit of the purpose, but there's other things like Tumblebit you probably heard about, which is a different way of doing mixing. I can talk to you too if you want to hear about that, but this is just different alternatives that people have to kind of put themselves in a large fund and obscure where it came from and where it's going to. And then I guess this is just a small thing too, but another way of mixing really quickly is like with altcoin shifting. So you could take shapeshift and you could literally just throw in, like if you had some dirty Bitcoin, you could just go from Zcash to Dash to Litecoin to Monero and then back to your Bitcoin. There's like the good thing about this is that your privacy is enhanced with each coin you move from. And it also looks like a normal transaction, so if someone was trying to find where all your dirty Bitcoin originally came from, they wouldn't be able to. It'd be much harder. However, the downside of altcoin shifting would be fees. It's a big thing that would get you. And then just really quickly on de-anonymization, how do you link someone from their pseudonym, like Dan said, or their address in Bitcoin to their real world identity? So there's several points in here. Just like having a transaction itself and giving away your address is essentially identifying yourself. But when you see people like within different social medias where they post their address, that's a way of really easily linking. And there's also this concept of clustering. So let's see, if you know, hopefully address with 5 Bitcoin. Yeah, so I guess clustering, what I remember from it is like you would have, if the output is only 10 and you have 3 inputs, one of 5 Bitcoin, one of 3 Bitcoin, and one of 2 Bitcoin, obviously you know that that those are likely the same addresses from the same person. That's all one person. I guess, just have to make sure that you understand how the UTXO model works for that to make sense. And then if you've heard of like several companies like Scry and Elliptic, these are big companies that actually will use some of the clustering that I've talked about, where they will actually link your real-world identity. And this is something that people are really threatened about because they have the potential to sell your data, or link identities and sell them to larger corporations. That would be really scary.
Yeah, so these are both what would be considered private blockchain investigation consultant firms.
I think so, yeah.
I know Elliptic is based out of England, so they're basically doing contracting work for law enforcement agencies like Interpol, and they'll be the ones who are linking, Ross Ulbricht of the Silk Road probably to the Bitcoin that he just basically moved his from whatever the business address was that he had for Silk Road to his personal address, and law enforcement was pretty easily able to just see that one-to-one transfer and link him to all that money. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting development in the space for sure.
And then this is something so transactional graph analysis, this graph is way outdated, but like you could basically take certain data and identify different companies. Like this is a great way to, so like right here we have Satoshi Dice, we have Mt. Gox, and like Silk Road, and like this was during I think like maybe 2013 when they took this from a Cornell study. UCSD. Okay, so UCSD, and essentially you could look at graphs like these that would allow you to identify certain businesses. So circle size from here is the volume, and so back in 2013, what could you have done? You could have inferred that, I wonder who has the most volume. Oh, likely it's Mt. Gox. Obviously, Mt. Gox doesn't exist anymore, but you could tell that was likely them, and then identify the addresses from there. And then the edges, this mega one right here, I think is Satoshi Dice. Obviously, they don't have a ton of volume, but they have a ton of transactions happening. And so you can just infer from that, and you can link addresses through a transactional graph analysis. Just another additional, I'd like to get a more updated version, but yeah. And then we just quickly wanted to go through some thoughts for the time ahead, like specifically what you might see in 2018, maybe 2019 in regards to privacy. You want to cover?
Yeah, so one of the projects that I'm most excited about is the development of the Lightning Network. You're seeing a lot of the original Bitcoin people putting their time and effort towards this. It's a second layer scaling solution that solves the issue right now of is it really feasible for me to pay for my coffee, my $2 coffee every day with Bitcoin? So what the Lightning Network does is kind of set up these trusted nodes on the network that are providing this temporary liquidity, kind of fronting smaller transactions for individual payments, and then maybe every day it would settle onto the main Bitcoin blockchain. But some of the worries with this system include centralization. Anytime you have this trusted node, you're trusting them with a lot of this transactional information, and with that, the privacy of these transactions. But it is something that they're thinking about, and there's going to be ways, ideally, of ensuring that maybe the node isn't able to pick and choose transactions that it wants to process, and working around that. Kind of similar to the way that I think people are worried about mining centralization and how, the 51% attack, you don't want any one company doing too well in that industry and making all the money, kind of forcing everyone out of it. But hopefully that's something Satoshi kind of gamed out when he was originally planning all this stuff, and that's why you have people still working on the network today. That's all I have for this.
Okay, so Schnorr signatures, these are pretty interesting. So right now, how you generate So right now we use ECDSA to generate our public-private keys, right? So there's this thought of using Schnorr signatures. So Schnorr signatures were originally a patented technology, but recently they're gaining more research because their patent only expired maybe like 5 years ago. And so they're thought of replacing them with the current signatures scheme that we use. So just to briefly touch up on some of what they do besides the privacy features. So Schnorr would offer a lighter, more efficient signature than a current scheme. So they have a max size of 64 bytes, while ECDSA have like 73 to 72, I think it is, but a max of 75. But what's really special about Schnorr is the fact that they would be able to aggregate signatures together. So like right here, right now, as you see, when you make a transaction, you need to sign off all of your outputs to make it a valid transaction. However, with Schnorr, you would actually be able to reduce, you'd be able to aggregate your signatures to one signature itself. And so obviously that's really exciting because that would have the potential to reduce a lot of the size. And privacy, it actually also would incentivize privacy because you'd be doing a lot of large multi-signature transactions. So I got this from Nopara73. He's a pretty prominent like Medium article writer. I would definitely recommend reading him if you're interested. I think he is working on Tumblebit, but essentially this is the thing I got off directly. Today, a CoinJoin transaction with 100 inputs must also hold 100 signatures, right? So this large CoinJoin transaction that you talked about. With Schnorr, you need only one signature, and that would make CoinJoin transactions about 30 to 40% cheaper than normal transactions. It's a really big thought. I mean, I haven't done too much like really in-depth research, but you know, it would be exciting to see something like that. And then finally, we wanted to touch up on Imblewimble and Grin. I think I might want to do a really in-depth analysis on Imblewimble and Grin because it's a really interesting project. Potentially, what it would offer is it's kind of like Bitcoin, but removing it to its bare bones, taking Bitcoin and just like making it in a skeleton essentially. So right now, Bitcoin, we have Bitcoin script, right? So what does that allow us to do? Lightning, it allows us to do like multi-signature transactions, atomic swaps. So we have here with Bitcoin script in its computational flexibility. Ethereum is probably way over there with Turing complete. And then Imblewimble would be on the total opposite side of that, right? And so it's this opportunity to actually reduce, take out Bitcoin script and make something that's scalable and private at the same time. So Imblewimble is a protocol, and Grin is a project you can look up on GitHub right now. It's potentially it's an open source project that's written in Rust, which is known for its scalability and speed. And there are three main properties that Grin transactions provide. So instead, you would have no addresses, you would have no amounts, and you'd essentially be having something that would just be purely money. And you'd have no Bitcoin script. Again, I think it's like, you know, I can get really technical, but it's just another alternative that would provide for some really exciting features to come in 2018. And I would highly recommend, if you have the time, look this up and understand how it works, because it's really something interesting that might come up in the near future.
What is this picture right there?
Oh, okay. So the funny thing is, yeah. So Imblewimble and Grin. So to give you a little backstory, in 2016, there was an anonymous user, just like there was with Monero, just like there was with Bitcoin, who posted this text file to like an IRC chat, basically outlining Imblewimble, and his name was Tom Ellis Jetasaur, and that's the French translation of Tom Riddle. If anyone knows who Tom Riddle is, does anyone know?
Harry Potter.
Yeah, it's a Harry Potter. Tom Riddle is Voldemort in Harry Potter. And it was this, you know, the whole Imblewimble project has these little Easter eggs of Harry Potter in them. So Imblewimble is actually the name of like a tongue-tying spell you would cast on opponents. Grin is the name of like the bank in the Harry Potter world. So they have like all these kind of like cute connections, and like This is Ignotus Peveril, who's the lead developer of Grin, and he was the one that created the invisibility cloak. I know it's kind of cute, and it's kind of like,
The stories are the best
yeah,
part
yeah,
of some
exactly.
of these
Yeah,
projects.
but it's a really, nonetheless, it's a really interesting project, I think, that would be something worth checking out.
Could you just give a, sorry, yeah. Could you just give the intuition for how it works?
I don't want to do that right now. Like I've tried to explain it, and I just feel like I confuse people more. I'm not at the point where I could like give a good, fresh explanation. I would just go on their GitHub, look at their README, and if you can spend 5 minutes, I would definitely recommend doing. Like I asked Justin, the guy from Monero, like what's he's most excited for, and he said Grin and imblewimble. Make sure to tell these people about it. It's an interesting project. It's only been here for a couple of years, so if you have the time, definitely look it up because it's something you've thought. Yeah, I think that's it though. Yeah, so I mean, we can try to answer some of your questions. We're not experts like we said, but you know, I just want to give you a little bit of an update because this area is always nice to see grow. I think it's important just to kind of refresh every now and then. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. Very well done. So what are some things that you all do to keep your anonymity, or things that you would recommend doing?
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced using the Tor browser, which is just a free online software. It's actually a project started by the US government originally. And that's a pretty foolproof way of just getting started with anonymization on the internet. You know, if you really want to go full on with the whole project though, you have to, you know, you want to create probably a temporary email address to register to some of these exchanges that you have no real history with, and then you want to use a combination of VPN and Tor to buy any coin that you want to use. I don't know if you have any more experience you want to touch on, Brennan.
No, like you know, just make sure you do VPN too. Like TunnelBear is a pretty awesome service. But
Anytime you're even just using your home network, if you're not on some sort of system, on a general Starbucks Wi-Fi or something like that, I feel like there's still always this kind of way to map it back to you. That's the extent of my knowledge. Please.
I tried to use the Tor browser this week to buy airline tickets with it. Forget it. They want to push those cookies through to get you priced right.
Yeah.
And they just wouldn't let me book airline tickets through the Tor browser at all.
And it's slower using the Tor browser.
Yeah.
It's slower. Yeah.
Tor's an interesting, has a lot of backstory to it. I mean, like you said, like created in the 90s, right, by the Navy or something like that. And
Yeah.
now it's like, you know, it goes right back to that ethical question of like, where do you have that cost and benefit, right? I mean, you know, you do have people that will use it for anonymous activities, but then again, people will need it when, you know, their country will be overwatching them, and, you know, it's just another one of those questions of ethics and rising technology.
And I know VPN is a service that you do have to pay for. I don't know whether that's, I imagine something like a subscription, but if you are someone who, I imagine in China or something, and they're banning websites, they have firewalls in place, I think that the only recourse you have in that option is to use a VPN to get around that.
Yeah.
Please.
VPNs too.
They block VPNs.
Block VPNs, yeah.
So what is the means to get around that? I mean,
Yeah,
Is it?
especially for cryptocurrency. There's been researchers with network packaging and things like that.
Yeah.
It's encrypted, it's possible to kind of tell like where it's going and how many destinations that, whether it's cryptocurrency or it's like shooting out transactions.
right, and you know the Chinese government has the time and the willpower to go and
Yeah,
enforce
exactly.
any of that stuff because
And
they have to.
pretty much the anonymity of some of the coins kind of goes against the governments because they collect taxes and things like that on there. So I guess one thing that I'm wondering is the government definitely wants a cut of this.
Yeah.
The taxes and then things like that. Would there be a way to address that so that it can be used for everyday things.
To get around the taxes?
No, to actually take account of the taxes. But also the government just banned.
Well, yeah, I mean, so that gets into like these interesting questions. I know Arizona just passed some legislation that they're willing to accept their taxes in the form of Bitcoin. Illinois is working on some similar legislation. But I think it's just kind of being stuck in the old ways now, and the laws don't really move fast as the private industry does, and so they'll adapt somehow. And, but as far as I don't know how they're going to enforce it, I imagine it'll be just them saying, we'll accept it because they figure out how to do that.
Yeah, those two transaction records.
Right. I mean, and what their recourse is beyond that is beyond me.
Well, I think his point too is that if I'm very transactions on Monero, how can I tax the society if I don't know how much people are making?
Exactly. Also, government is banned probably.
And then you're going to go down this whole wormhole of a lot of these cypherpunk guys. The whole movement actually has a lot of foundation in the dissolution of some of these nation states as they exist today. To be honest, if you get into the more like Austrian economics, I think ties into that somehow, and where a lot of these guys come from philosophically.
Do you know in a Monero transaction, I don't know the guts of it, but so I know right now it's 6 in, 6 out, and I know you want to grow that, but could the US government theoretically like subpoena all 12 individuals and say, like, are the individuals themselves known?
No, I mean,
In the Monero transaction?
Like,
You
is
have
that one
to
transaction like that important to me? Could I subpoena all 12? Do I know the 12 involved? I can't remember.
you probably have to be the node that's the intermediary in that transaction, first off, to be able to have access to that information. And then from there, you're going to have to start doing some inference. I mean, it's going to take a lot of resources to start pinning those transactions on specific people.
But from the outside looking in, I don't know the 6 in, 6 out. Like if I'm just some random person going to the blockchain.
No, you only know probabilities if you're the most well-versed technical actor in that type of deal. Please.
I don't understand Lightning quite yet, so are they gonna soft fork that in at the end of every day? Because it's not gonna be verified from what I understand as far as like a regular block would be.
Yeah, I don't think that the right terminology around that is a soft fork. I think it's more of just them accumulating all these microtransactions over the course of a 24-hour period, and then it just kind of spits it out into this one larger transaction that it can throw onto the legitimate blockchain. But so where you see some competition is between the potentials of this Lightning network and the hard fork that you saw with Bitcoin Cash, which is kind of just this other proposed solution by those people who they just think if you increase the block sizes, that's the way around it. But it's kind of just always a temporary fix with those types of hard forks. And so to an extent, personally, I think it might be just being different for different sake, but that's beyond me. I don't know if anyone else has any. It's a very heated issue. I think we had a question in the back.
So most of the privacy that you talk about in here was privacy of token or coin transaction, right? So hiding the input, like the source, hiding the amounts, and hiding where they're going to, right? So, but there are other applications of blockchain technology like smart contracts, which go beyond simple value transfer from one account to another.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, what can be, so we know that there are all these clever ways of hiding transactions. So can these more complicated, can this more complicated logic be also encrypted in a similar way to, kind of hide, for example, if you're familiar with like CryptoKitties, like hide some properties of the kitten that you have read or something like that.
Yeah, and I'm not super well versed on this, Brennan. Maybe you can speak to this a little bit better, but I would say I'm sure there is a way to do that, to just throw these kind of cryptographic means around that extra information, but it all comes at this cost of larger transactions, larger blocks that need to be processed, slower transaction times. Does anyone else have any maybe smarter takes on that? That's all to the extent of it. CryptoKitties is a weird one because I've heard that's not even really a decentralized system. That's like there's this central organization that issues them out and manages those CryptoKitties. It's Ethereum's greatest, what do they call it, application thus far. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to consider.
So I mean, there was one thing on the slide that said voting, and I do know that there is some work done to use Zcash Snarks on Ethereum to create this voting smart contract that actually hides the individual votes themselves, but there's a way to reveal the total count or tally of when all the votes are combined, right? So that's sort of one additional thing you could do. You could anonymize, but
do you know the name of that project at all? Because that's definitely an interesting thing, because Ethereum is so good with just putting your own kind of systems into it, right?
I know they tested, like they've already tested Zcash Snarks, but if you try to like do any Google searching of Snarks itself and Ethereum, you won't really find much. Like the latest updates you see are since like September, when like Vitalik first said he was going to do them. I know they were released in the Metropolis update, or whatever the term is. Like I know Ethereum has different stages of their updates, and I know specifically they were gonna. I know they already had it tested. I don't know exactly where it is, but I know that that did not put it past me that happened.
Question?
I was wondering if you guys knew the transaction graph you showed. How do they actually determine those? Like, I know there's the Mt. Gox thing. There's an investigation done about a whole bunch of addresses that were associated with Mt. Gox. How did they actually?
Yeah, no. It was a study this study had a specific algorithm that I can definitely show you the source. I couldn't tell you how they did this, but I just know that that's what it represents, and this is a pretty common way to identify certain addresses through this. This is meant more for like larger businesses, right? This is not meant for individuals itself. Like, it's just meant for identifying something like Mt. Gox or identifying something like Satoshi Dice, right? You can identify by distinguishing it. I think it would not be as easy as it was back then, because like there's very few, like there's only one big Mt. Gox, right? Now you have like Coinbase, you have like GDEX, you have Bittrex, Bitfinex, like you have all these big exchanges that make it a little bit harder. But regardless, I can definitely share you the source if you'd like to find more.
Yeah, and there was some process of significant inference and mapping onto this, where they might not know it for sure, but they're using a very educated guess using whatever kind of information they have to map these names onto these nodes.
I mean, Satoshi Dice nodes was a single address, right? So if you have that single address, you can create a huge circle by yourself. It's not that difficult. If you know what that single address is, just label it. So many dice can go in now.
Are you familiar with Satoshi Dice?
What Satoshi does?
Dice. Are you familiar with
Dice?
it? Yeah, okay, yeah, I couldn't answer that. Satoshi Dice, that'd be an interesting history project, but yeah, I'm not too familiar. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's just what we kind of wanted to give, so.
Any last questions?
You brought up a good point with the voting rights. Would the block ledger be, somewhat autonomous with that, because it's just a vote?
Yeah, so I imagine it's a matter of just creating the platform. You have to put that platform into the code, and then I think that is one of the greatest potential use cases for this blockchain, because a mutable ledger that is openly visible to everybody, and you can have a one-to-one. The tough part comes in kind of, you would have to use some KYC, know your customer, know your citizen system to like associate some form of identification, so you can't do multi-voting. But that is such an exciting use case that I keep looking at.
It's fast and it's anonymous.
Yeah, and with the blockchain, you kind of always do have this, people throw it around as just, oh, it's the solution for everything, but someone made a pretty funny Google Chrome plugin that just switched out wherever blockchain was printed on a website for a really big Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that has like a bunch of copies to it. And that's kind of what this is at the end of the day. It's just a way of distributing a database and changing that database. So yeah, I think voting is such a cool project that's worthwhile, whoever's working on that.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, thank you all again for coming. It's awesome to see you.